All right, I think we're ready to go. The obviously the new phone system, in the words of a very wise man that I know, was oversold. All right, um, so here, where are we actually headed now? Where are we going with all of this? There are so many things to discuss here at the beginning of the week. All the stuff that's up in the air. I think I've said it to the point of ad nauseum. Well, wait a second. Yes,
The new,
Paul.
the new call-in number is 801-829-7727.
So
And
that
you just answer it when it comes up on the screen.
so that's for me to call into the station?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, I've been sending out messages to everything that you
oh,
do.
I thought that was for listeners to call into the station.
Now it's you as well. It's the same as,
All right.
it's a lot better, still not what we want. 801-829-7727. Then answer it right there when you see it.
So I should do that now.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Paul. This is an unknown contact. Add the contact. Well, let's try it again. Doesn't sound like I got through. Let's try it again. Oh, there it is down here. All right. Maybe I'm on there now. All right. All right. Let's, for those of you patiently on this, oh, nobody. Okay. Don't blame you. All right. This is the point of my life where my cynicism kicks in. And, I'll try to, I will try to adapt from here and see if I can make some sense of what's going on. Thanks, Paul. All right, and let's see if I can get the recording going for what that's worth. Um, I'm not sure what has the more dramatic effects in my life, world events or the ongoing events at K-Talk Radio. Anyway, good morning. It's the 26th day of the 26th day of January 2026. Is it the last Monday? Oh no, I guess we've got another Monday after today of January. And the winter of no snow here in the Intermountain West. I was talking to a member of the Utah Water Board, or whatever they're called, the other day. Happens to be a patient. And they were telling me that no, don't worry, because there are plenty of historical precedents for heavy March or February, March snow. They don't think they could get enough snow to make up for what we haven't gotten. But they said the real problem is next year, not this year. The aquifers are full. The aquifers that the farmers rely upon in late summer for the last watering to get them through the fourth cutting of their alfalfa and animals and whatever else. They said for the most part they don't need to really worry about that unless of course there's no snow at all, because the aquifers are pretty full from last year's snow. The problem is that we don't get snow this year. The problem is going to be next year. when the aquifers are empty. And that's consistent in my understanding of living in a desert. Now, boy, all the things that are going on out there. I had some communication with Harley earlier. I don't think he's going to be able to make it this morning. So I want to go on here with some of the latest stuff that's going on. A little bit about Davos, China really blasting the fraud of this Board of Peace. I mean, when you figure the idea that the board is a billionaires club, just a couple of mentions, because a lot of people are talking about it as a Trojan horse to take the place of the United Nations. Here's the power of the oligarchs. You've seen what the oligarchs were doing in Russia since 1991 on. You see what the oligarchs are doing in the United States, what the oligarchs in Israel are doing. Interesting, the Israeli oligarchs and the American oligarchs, for a large portion, are the same people. That's why we have an Israel first policy now in America. America second, Israel first. And with this attempt to bring all these super powerful, rich oligarchs together to create this board of peace that was launched by the president at Davos last week, they note that the ostensible purpose, of course, of the board was to resolve the disaster in Gaza, and that the representatives from the two key parties, Israel and Palestine, just happened to be absent at this meeting. It's like having a peace deal with the Ukraine war situation and not inviting Russia to the discussion. Other than the U.S. itself, the only other members of the permanent five of the Security Council, Russia, China, UK, and France, were also absent. So they must not have enough oligarchs. So the question on everybody's mind is, does it intend to replace and usurp the responsibilities of the UN, which, of course, is the direction it seems to be headed. Now, what's at stake, of course, is international law. And our president, regardless of what you think of him, and as you notice, his popularity is dropping precipitously right now, to the point where there are those who are predicting a bloodbath in the midterms, whereupon shortly after the new Congress is sworn in January of 27, the president may well be headed to jail if the Republicans lose both houses. What's at stake is the international law, I said. And as the president said, there is no international law anymore. President Trump said, what limits him is not international law, not agreements with other countries, not the Constitution, not domestic law, let alone international law, not treaties, and treaties, of course, become law once they're sustained by Congress. It's his sense of morality that is his limiting factor. And so you hope you have somebody like Marcus Aurelius in that position, or even Augustus Caesar, but it wasn't all that bad. Caligula that followed Tiberius was pretty bad. But, and for those who are of the LDS faith, the admonition of King Benjamin in the book of Mosiah, in the book of Mormon, is talking about the best government of all is a king, the philosopher king, the king who puts the welfare of the least in his kingdom as important as the oligarchs. And we are moving, I think, in that direction, but I'm not so sure of the philosophy of the king. So this abandonment of international law and this current international order is undergoing some profound transformation right now. And its direction probably shouldn't deviate too much from the track of trying to consolidate and safeguard the fundamental interests of the vast number of countries involved, and at the same time not undermine the prevailing trend of economic globalization that benefits all the nations. So the UN is the most authoritative international organization built by humanity after the tribulations of war and making immense sacrifices to avoid conflict, and by its own charter to ensure peace. It not only entrusts major powers with the responsibility of maintaining international peace, but to bring in the inclusive, acceptable, multilateral mechanisms, excuse me, for human development, and address the major challenges that are going on. And when you bypass the UN, as they're doing right now, it's equivalent to weakening the authority of international law, which of course is just going to open up a Pandora's box of hidden dangers for future conflicts when the apparatus is no longer in place to sit down and talk about things before you start shooting bullets. And so this so-called board of peace, I think it's really a board of multi-billionaires. This club trying to take over the world because the deep state and the international banking cartel couldn't get the United States to do it fast enough. So what they're going to do is drop all barriers and just let loose the dogs of war. And so this billionaires club, the notion that contributions to the Board of Peace of more than $1 billion would purchase seats on the Board of Peace, or maybe if they up the ante a little bit, permanent membership, just puts international power up for sale. I mean, this runs counter to the principle of equality that international mechanisms were meant to uphold through the operation of the United Nations. And so there are leading European nations who are refusing to join this. And the emergence of these divisions, even among the Western countries, obviously shows that the Board of Peace has failed to foster any unity whatsoever. In fact, it's just increasing the maelstrom of international fragmentation, and attempts to establish an organizational parallel to some kind of international law that the UN tried to do. Well, it's running counter to that. I mean, peace is not a slogan. It has to be carefully nurtured and above all realized through the concrete participation of all parties, the smallest among us as well as the biggest. But then the UN has simply been a stepping stool for the United States anyway. And with the veto power that the United States has in the UN Security Council, with most of the other members voting to censor Israel for the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians, the United States continues to veto any action against Israel in that regard, which makes us hand in glove party to the genocide. Now, I'm going to jump around to a few different places. The Russia-U.S.-Ukraine talks going on in Abu Dhabi. Again, here's another confusing thing. I mean, the second day of the Russia-U.S.-Ukraine talks ended without any official statements. Although Steve Witkoff posted on X, he said this: on Friday and Saturday, the United States coordinated a trilateral meeting alongside Ukraine and Russia, graciously hosting the United Arab Emirates. Talks were very constructive. Plans were made to continue conversations next week in Abu Dhabi. President Trump and his entire team are dedicated to bringing peace to this war. Now, the silence from both Russia and the United States, with no official statements outside of what Witkoff had to say, And the fact that the Russian team was comprised of military figures indicates the seriousness of the talk. Because remember back in Alaska last summer at Anchorage, most of the Russian delegation were businessmen. And when we thought that the talks there in Anchorage were designed to bring an end to the Ukraine war, though it was to some extent, it was mostly about ongoing business relationships, economic treaties, understandings, lifting of sanctions between the United States and Russia. This meeting in Abu Dhabi, on the other hand, in contrast to Anchorage, was made of majority of Russian military figures meeting with Witkoff. So that would definitely indicate, at least in my mind, the seriousness of these talks, combined with some other comments like from Medvedev that I'm going to mention here in a minute. I mean, it should not be forgotten that just a few weeks ago, the CIA was implicated in a decapitation strike against Putin. And the pieces that were recovered from some of the drones, especially the electronic guidance systems of these drones, were delivered to the American attaché in Moscow to be taken back to America. And, you know, like, look at this. Look and see if you don't find what we found in these electronics. That these things were guided by you, and they were guided to Putin's residence in Valdai. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Well, the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, in a really substantive interview on Kommersant's senior correspondent, Chernyenko, on the topic of the looming START deadline. Remember, today's the 26th. I think it's 2 weeks maybe, and the START treaty comes to an end. The strategic arms, the last one of them, comes to an end. And so they were talking about this, and which had been negotiated, and it was put together by President Medvedev in that interim term between first and second terms of Putin, and Barack Obama back in 2010. And Kommersant points out that if the U.S. fails to respond seriously to Putin's proposal to just go ahead and extend it for at least one more year, Medvedev said Moscow and Washington will be without arms control agreements for the first time in over half a century, and without any negotiating process to develop any new ones. But Medvedev said in the beginning, the New START, as it was called, he said, fulfilled its purpose in creating predictability and stability, although the Russian side had complaints against the American side regarding specific provisions of the treaty. He said the problems emerged not due to the quality, but to the irresponsible U.S. approach to its implementation and to the entire Russian-American relationship. So, what is the Russian response to this? This is what's critical here in this latest event. Because as far as resuming any kind of agreements on arms control, Medvedev said, above all, a basic normalization of Russian-American relations is necessary. After all, under Biden, they have deteriorated to a level significantly worse than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He also said, we see the new U.S. administration is attempting to rethink the reckless and extremely risky course of the previous American administration, which sought to inflict strategic defeat on our country. This is a shift in the right direction, but the progress is too slow. We are only at the beginning of the journey. Success is not guaranteed. This is especially true given that Donald Trump is inherently unstable in his political orientations. That's, read flip-floppy there in what they're saying. So he said Russia will wait till February 5 to see if there's a U.S. response to Putin's offer to extend it another year. But the positive indications from the American side simply not sufficient at this point to counter destabilizing initiatives such as the the golden dome that Trump wants to create and the resumption of nuclear weapons testing that Trump wants to do. And Medvedev said that he believes that if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, that Russia would no longer exist. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's an incredible statement. He's the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council. What would the Russian Security Council include? Yeah, just about everything of a security and armed nature. And he said, we honestly believe that if Russia did not have nukes, we would no longer exist. And he said that more nations are likely to develop nuclear weapons in the near future. And he said that since Biden, the Europeans, and the United States have been provoking Russia to make very tough decisions, including by launching the drone attack at the end of the year on Putin's residence. This could have been grounds for a retaliatory strike, including the use of special weapons, he said. And then in conclusion, Medvedev said this. Now, if you know anything about Medvedev, you kind of have to read between the lines because he can be very outspoken, controversial, incendiary, and he's kind of has to be reined back in from time to time by Putin. But he's a very smart man, and he's in the position he's in, not because he's a fool, like many members of our own State Department, the Israel First crowd, but because he has some understanding of international relations. And so he said this at the end: if we are not heard, we will respond proportionately. Seeking, he said, to restore parity. Or we create something fundamentally new, he said. Something that will calm our enemies for a long time. Therefore, the successful operation, he said, of the Russian defense industry is a tranquilizer for the neurotics in the club of Russia's enemies. Why can't we have somebody in America talk like that? Why can't we have people in our own State Department or either House of Congress be able to talk so statesmanly like? Anyway, now I've been constantly barraged by emails over the weekend about Minneapolis. And while acting as a legal observer with only a cell phone in his hand, Alex Preddy, 37 years old, who's a nurse at an intensive care unit of the Veterans Hospital of Minneapolis, was killed on the 24th by a barrage of gunfire from a paramilitary agent of the Customs and Border Protection. And he has been seen, I've seen the various videos from different directions, trying to help a woman who had just been pushed to the ground by a CBP agent. And another CBP agent then tries to grab Preddy in order to spray Preddy in the face with these chemical irritants, but may have missed as they both then fell to the ground. And then Preddy is seen surrounded by 8 CBP agents who are beating and kicking him while he's on the pavement. And then Preddy's body goes limp after the first shot is fired. Now, I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm not saying if something is wrong here, very wrong, or something is just the result of behavior against armed policemen that one would want to be very careful of. I mean, I've even heard some people use the term suicide by cop. I don't think that's what's going on here. Now, U.S. presidential candidate Diane Sare conducted an interview with Colleen Rowley, an ex-FBI agent and trainer who has come out as a FBI whistleblower. And Rowley exposes that many of the cover-up tactics of the recent federal shootings in Minneapolis and explains a desensitized mentality that allows these killings to continue. Now she's an ex-FBI agent and a trainer for FBI agents in the field for deadly behavior, deadly action, and what to do when pistols are pulled. And she says that the desensitization started with migrants who are treated as less than human, and then later the protesters who are called insurrectionists. And she said she trained fellow FBI agents on use of force issues and has called for an independent investigation and jury trial of these shootings, which would follow the same standard procedures that have been used for years in any other use of force case. Now, because of the political pressure to close these Minneapolis shooting cases without investigations, 6 federal prosecutors in Minnesota, 4 top officials in the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division in Washington, and an FBI supervisor have all resigned in protest, demanding due process. That is 6 federal prosecutors in Minnesota, 4 top officials in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division back in D.C., and an FBI supervisor have all resigned over this. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA, secured a search warrant to examine the crime scene, but when they got there with the warrant, they were denied access by federal officials. And the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Superintendent Drew Evans said at a news conference that the warrant was an unusual move in a public area like that, but we did that attempting to have judicial approval to enter the scene to gather evidence. And then Tim Walz, the governor, regardless of what you think of him one way or the other, said at a news conference, Minnesota's justice system will have the last word on this. It must have the last word. As I told the White House in no uncertain terms this morning, the federal government cannot be trusted to lead this investigation. You know, every now and then something wise comes out of the mouth of those who you've already dismissed as being very unwise. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things about the U.S. withdrawing from WHO, but I might save that till Wednesday's health program. I have mixed feelings about it, but for the most part, I'm very much in favor of it. Especially since, 75% of the WHO's budget is your tax dollars and my tax dollars? Well, another U.S. aircraft carrier has been deployed. On January 24th, the USS Theodore Roosevelt departed Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego. On January 21, resuming operational activities after completing maintenance. And in a Facebook post, the U.S. Pacific Fleet confirmed that the carrier had begun her current deployment, but did not confirm where the ship is headed. So this makes 3 U.S. aircraft carriers underway, not counting the USS Gerald Ford, which at last report was still in the Caribbean. So the George H.W. Bush departed Norfolk, Virginia, January 13th, and the USS Abraham Lincoln is in the Indian Ocean, likely arriving in the Arabian Sea sometime this week. And whether the Roosevelt and or the Bush will be going to Southwest Asia remains to be seen, but they have all left their ports. So they're going somewhere. Now, I know what you're thinking because it's what I'm thinking. The obliteration that President Trump announced last summer of the Iranian nuclear facilities wasn't completely obliterated. Apparently, we have to go back and do some more obliteration. But there's a problem. And the problem is all the unknown, unrecognized, undesignated missile sites that the Iranians have clearly explained are targeted. The majority of for Israel, and the rest of them at American military sites throughout the Middle East, particularly Iraq and Syria. And so the Iranians, are continuing their saber rattling against the U.S. military strikes. The Iranian Defense Ministry spokesman, Reza Tlaib said on the 24th that Iran had increased the number of its missiles since the end of the war with Israel in late June. He said the quantitative and qualitative capacities of Iran's missile power have increased compared to the imposed 12-day war, and the country's missile defense capability has been strengthened and become more effective thanks to the experiences gained in that war. So, with 4 aircraft carriers floating around out there and the entire battle group that's involved with each one, and as far as we know, the Ford is still sitting, the largest of them all, is still sitting there in the Caribbean with very little activity taking place with Venezuela. I wouldn't be surprised if they started heading for the Mediterranean Sea at any time. Now, what changed? What's happened in the last 2 months? What has taken place as far as America's foreign policy regarding war and the like are concerned? The 2026 National Defense Strategy, released a week ago, makes domination of the Western Hemisphere in the name of Homeland Security the number one priority in its chapter called the security environment. Now, I'm going to quote some of this to you so you can see where some of this stuff is coming from. Now, just before I do that, I want to mention again the special that I have in my clinic. My goodness, the number of people who are coming in who have been suffering for decades of pain. I have seen at least 3 people this last week. I've seen several new patients, but at least 3 who are 65 plus in their age, late 60s up to early 80s, who were injured in their 20s. And one of them was this lady in her 20s that got hit 3 times by a tractor trailer. The first one hit her, knocked her sideways. In the attempt of the tractor to miss her, it spun around and the trailer came around and hit her a second time after the cab had hit her, and then trying to straighten itself out, forced her into the wall that was the outer border of the road she was on, the freeway, and smacked again by the trailer. As is the case with many patients that I see, they have been everywhere, done everything, been through various chiropractors, physical therapists, have been consulted with various orthopedists who tell them, yeah, you're kind of messed up pretty bad in this x-ray, but not enough to really warrant surgery. And then others say, well, yeah, we could do some surgery, but we're not really positive you're going to get the outcome you want. And they hear this over and over again, decade after decade. And then they finally come in. I say, well, how do you know about it? I always ask a new patient, who told you about this? Where are you coming from? And well, actually, I've been listening to you for a long time, but when you cut your fee in half, I thought maybe I'd take a chance. Okay, well, I'm glad that worked for you. So this particular lady, I can see her in front of me right now. I've only seen her once. and just horrific pain up the left shoulder, into the left side of her neck, into the left side of her head, that has literally been there since her 20s. Off and on, but lately, recently, the last few months, unrelenting and getting worse. And you can see it in their eyes that they're done, they're through. And if this doesn't work, they may do something really drastic. So I took some pictures. But it was a pretty bad misalignment. I mean, you don't grow up the way this X-ray looks. You don't grow up into that kind of a pattern. You have to get knocked into it. And I worked on her. It only took about 10 minutes. And she stood up, her spine straightened up. She held her head wasn't tipped off to the left, her head was vertical. And she's walking around with this utter shocked look on her face. What are you feeling? Nothing. What do you mean nothing? I'm not feeling any pain. And I said, well, turn your head to the left a little bit. And then she kind of grimaced because there was still some inflammation there. She said, oh, well, yeah, that's there. I said, is it any different? Yeah, it's not nearly as bad. And they just have this utter look of surprise on their face. The surprise, I said, why didn't somebody do this already? Why did I have to wait this long? After all the help that I've sought after, why did it take this long? Well, that's one of the major questions that I get. Now, she's just one of 3 people I saw this last week with similar situation. Early injuries. One was an older fellow who just got the devil kicked out of him in high school football. And he's in his early 70s. Limping. He walks like a parentheses, the closing parentheses, leaning way off to the left. His bottom half's going to the right, the top half's kicked back to the left with his terrible limp. And how long you been like this? My whole life. What have you done about it? Everything. Been everywhere, seen everything, taken every drug, every therapy. Nothing helped me. Well, why are you here now? Because you cut your price in half. Okay. Let's see if we can help you out. And immediately, he probably straightened up 75 to 80%. And the wobble was gone. And the cramping in the left side of his lower back that went into his leg was gone. Simply by straightening him up a little bit. So I'm going to keep this half price thing going. For those, especially when I'm seeing people who've been suffering for decades, who didn't come in because they thought I was too expensive. And they always say, well, is there anybody else doing this? Not the way I do it. And then they're afraid to come in because they're going to get set up on some long, ongoing care package thing. No, we don't do that. We fix it. I'm not going to set you up to see you weekly for the next 25 years. That's ridiculous. Our job, our mission here is to fix the problem. And within 2 to 3 visits, 9 out of 10 people we see within 2 to 3 visits are 90% better and start holding their corrections. You have to make an appointment. You can't just walk in because the first visit involves too much time. You just call the office 801-523-1890, 801-523-1890, or you can go to jackstockwell.com, and I think you can schedule something online there. And plan on an hour and a half to 2 hours. That involves taking films, working on you, taking some more films afterwards to make sure I did what you're paying me to do. But I always tell everybody during the consultation, that immediately after I work on you, you are going to feel something, and you may not be able to describe it, but you know something has happened because you're going to feel completely different. And I tell them that right up front. And that kind of puts me in a position where I darn well better deliver the goods, I'll tell you. So I'm just going to continue this for a while because it's bringing in people who should have come in years ago, but they thought I was too expensive. So I cut the price in half. 801-523-1890. All right, now let me get back to the National Defense Strategy. This is imperialism. This is pure imperialism. Now listen to this. I'm going to quote from it. For decades, America's foreign policy establishment neglected our nation's homeland defenses. This was partly due to the view that such defenses were no longer necessary. But it was also informed by an increasing desire on the part of Washington decision makers to ease border controls and facilitate the illegal migration of people and the unchecked, unfair flow of goods, which is, a not so veiled swipe at the previous Democratic administration, of course. And now Trump's kidnapping of Venezuela President Maduro, quote, shows that President Trump is deadly serious about preventing narco-terrorists from trafficking lethal narcotics into our country. As early as the 19th century, our predecessors recognized that the United States must take a more powerful, leading role in hemispheric affairs in order to safeguard our nation's own economic and national security. It was this insight that gave rise to the Monroe Doctrine and subsequent Roosevelt corollary. It ignores, of course, perhaps deliberately, that the intention, and this is not in the new security statement, the original intention of the Monroe Doctrine was to protect the newly independent nations of the Americas from European imperialism, not to replace it with American imperialism. Back to the document. But the wisdom of this approach, that is the imperial Roosevelt corollary, was lost as we took our dominant position for granted, even as it started to slip away. As a result, we have seen adversaries' influence grow from Greenland in the Arctic to the Gulf of America, the Panama Canal, and locations further south. This not only threatens the U.S. access to key terrain throughout the hemisphere, it also leaves America less stable and secure, undermining both U.S. interests and those of our regional partners. So that's where this stuff is coming from. We have the executive branch of government put out this statement that the Americas is ours. Now, I really like Jeffrey Sachs. And he was talking about Mark Carney's speech at the Davos conference. I don't know that I'm going to really have time to get into that today because there's some other things I want to talk about. But he said something very interesting about Canada, and that Canada is not going to be absorbed by the United States. Canada belongs to the Canadians. And he's trying to get a new trade deal with the United States, but standing his ground, which I think is interesting in light of the fact that there are thousands upon thousands of Albertans lining up in the province of Alberta to sign the secession petition, that Alberta has every intention of seceding from the Canadian nation. I think that's kind of cute. All right, now I've got some other stuff I want to get into, not the least of which a little bit of an update with Ukraine. Apparently there are over 2 million Ukrainians right now dodging the military draft. Now, when we talk about attrition and the constant diminution of the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers available for battle on the battlefield against the Russian army, part of the problem may be the 2 million Ukrainians that are dodging the draft. They're saying that there are 2.2 million men that are currently on the run. That amounts to 6.8% of the Ukrainian population, slightly larger than the percentage of Asians that are in the United States. Now, this is a Russian publication saying this. I don't know why they would want to compare that number, or what the idea is of comparing the number of draft dodgers to the number of Asians in the United States. But apparently we've got about a little over 2 million Asians in this country. I would think it's a lot more than that, but in any event. I have a daughter-in-law that's Asian, and so I have a granddaughter, I guess, is half Asian, although she was born in America. But the new Ukrainian defense minister, Fedorov, shockingly revealed, this is from the Ukrainians themselves, from the new defense minister. And he said 200,000 men have already deserted thus far, and 10 times more, 2 million, are actively dodging the draft, which are probably an underestimate, but in any case, really large numbers. So 200,000 have deserted. 2 million more are dodging the draft. Now, to put that in context, Ukraine claimed in early 2025 to have had a population of 32 million, likely an overestimate. So the 2.2 million men who either deserted or dodged the draft amounts to just under 7% of the population currently on the run. And the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada deputy Dmitry Razakov claimed that during a parliamentary session last month that his country had already lost 500,000 troops, and by then with an equal number of wounded, which also is probably an underestimate, while the Ukraine is thought to currently field around 900,000 active troops. Now, all of this data enables those who are observing this to better understand the significance of these voluntary losses, since it should be clear that by now, the 2.2 million more troops would certainly have made a major difference in the Ukraine. So it's the Ukrainian government that is saying these numbers. 200,000 desertions, 2.2 million dodging the draft. At the same time, they have just under 1 million active duty. Now, those 200,000 plus the 2 million, 2.2 million more soldiers on the field would have made a tremendous difference, especially all along the front line through Lugansk and Donetsk, all the way to Zaporizhia, even Kursk. Now, this isn't to imply that it would have been able to reverse the military strategic dynamics of the conflict that have trended in Russia's favor ever since the epic failure of the Ukraine's NATO-backed counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. But perhaps it might have been able to decelerate the pace of its losses afterwards. So the Ukraine could have also been in a comparatively better diplomatic position going into Trump 2.0 a year ago, that might have in turn predisposed him to a relatively harder line towards Russia. But interesting, for that reason, while the scale of its desertions and draft dodging can't credibly be described as a game changer, it can still be considered a significant variable that adversely affects Ukraine's military fortunes. And by contrast, there never was a relevant factor for Russia, which hasn't conscripted anyone, unlike the Ukraine. There is no draft in Russia. It's a volunteer force. It always has been from the beginning. Now, Putin offered those who were interested in joining the military salaries that were 4 times greater than the average labor salary for a non-military man or woman in Russia. So there was certainly a monetary advantage to joining the Russian army, but there has never been a draft nor conscription like there is in the Ukraine. And along with that, I think it's worthwhile reminding everybody about Ukraine's forcible conscription policy that's been made infamous by these viral videos showing officials snatching young and old men alike off the streets and hurrying them to a van or a truck and then off to base camp. Now, and I've seen these videos, and then the stories that draft eligible males, 25 to 60, heard through the grapevine are partly why 2 million of them have decided to go on the run and dodge the draft. And there's also the drone footage taking place in the conflict zone, and therefore well aware how likely it is that they would be killed very shortly after arriving to the front. And I think these men might sincerely consider themselves to be Ukrainian patriots. However, they might want to conceptualize this because they're not willing to die for nothing. So this segues into the plummeting popularity of this conflict among the Ukrainian population and increasing support for a very quick end of this conflict per a recent Gallup poll. And then Trump just blamed Zelensky for stalling the peace talks, which is in direct opposition to the will of the same people in whose name he still acts despite the expiration of his term back in May of 2024. So other than the declaration of martial law that he gave back then that keeps him in power, figuratively, the corruption is likely responsible for his obstinance since he thought to be profiting from the conflict and might fear charges once this conflict comes to an end, the same as Netanyahu in Israel. The legal action that can result in lifetime imprisonment for Netanyahu and his wife has been held up under Israeli law, postponed until this conflict with Hamas is over. So it's in the best interest of Netanyahu to keep that fight going. So whenever Trump has been asked about the conflict, he usually says that he wants to end it as soon as possible in order to stop the killing. I think that was the last words out of his mouth on the subject, which it's now known has spooked at least 2.2 million Ukrainian men and either deserting or dodging the draft. And the 6.8% of the population that's currently on the run, as I said, according to the last U.S. Census, is slightly larger than the Asian population in this country. And so the sooner that conflict ends, the sooner they can re-enter the economy and rebuild their own country, unless they free abroad first. And any kind of bringing the war to an end of any nature at all is going to have to be able to repatriate these men back into society. They're going to have to be given the promise that they're not going to be prosecuted. All right, now a couple more things about Alex Preddy. Some of the comments that said he was armed and he got shot because he was armed, some of those comments have been tempered a little bit now, that he wasn't brandishing a gun in a threatening way. And indications are that he legally possessed the weapon But from the various videos that I saw myself from various directions, all I've ever seen is a phone. So I'm looking at some photos right now where he's being forced to the ground, and his hands do not seem to be handling anything. So the question is, did this have to happen? Was he shot wrongfully? Was ICE correct? Was ICE justified? Was Preddy wrong? Did Preddy cause his own death? Did ICE use excessive force? Where is the brandishing gun? The idea of suicide by cop involves brandishing a weapon in the presence of armed policemen, and the apparent threat to their life. They're going to put you down fast. And they don't put you down to wound you. They put you down to end you. But you have to be brandishing a weapon. So all we see is a cell phone. And a gun on you does not mean that you're brandishing a gun. And if they were to happen, just imagine yourself with a side holster with an automatic pistol in it, just your typical 9mm, regardless of how many rounds might be in the magazine, a 9mm, and under your shirt, under your jacket, and you actually physically get involved with a policeman who's equally armed, openly. And he puts you down and tries to handcuff you, and in the means of doing that, notices that you have a weapon in a holster that you didn't bother to tell him in advance. And how's that policeman going to respond to this? Well, as long as he has your hands under control, it's a little less worrisome, but if your hand got free, this is suicide by cop, as far as I'm concerned. Not Preddy, but being in a situation like that. But because you have a gun in a holster on your waist, doesn't mean you're brandishing it. But the administration is acting like he was brandishing the gun. So Preddy was being held by 6 ICE agents, shot with his back to them. How was that a threat? Especially when you say disarmed him. Was this just too much testosterone, too much overreaction? Were the ICE agents who attacked him prior, just moments earlier, tragically losing control? Is this really tragedy due to miscommunication? Listen, I want to stand with ICE. I really do. I like the idea of taking people who don't belong here. I know there's various grades of seriousness of that. I understand that. But I also understand the law, and I understand borders. And but this one stinks. A man is dead. We should not be afraid to talk too much about this messy, painful mess, as it is for his family who's in pain, and the ICE agent that's got to be in regret and pain for this. I'm not blaming anybody because I don't have all the facts. But it doesn't look good for ICE. And ICE said they disarmed him. If they did, then where's the threat? And why was he punched in his head when he was down? And the witnesses who were standing around said they saw no gun. How were these defensive shots? What did no mean when she said that? Kind of wonder if we're watching the same thing. But this really stinks. And with that, I'm going to end today's show. Maybe we'll have more information on this by tomorrow. Stop the recording at this point. And I need to return K-Talk back to what was playing there before I got on. And until the next broadcaster gets involved. I am just going to continue playing what was there. And I will see you all tomorrow. Those of you who are listening on the stream, thanks for your, if you think that this is any value, please share it so we can increase the numbers a bit. If you think somebody else might be benefited by listening to this, please share it. It wouldn't hurt to subscribe. That helps the numbers. And I'll see you all tomorrow. And for those of you on the stream, thanks for your participation. And I will, for the Epstein's, let's go. I should have answered some of these comments, and I'm sorry I didn't get to them. We'll see what we can do.